This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive into a really pivotal moment. Today we're going to be talking about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Right.
Looking at the military rationale behind them.
Okay.
We're going to be working from a podcast episode from Mr. Hutchings History called The Military Rationale for Atomic Warfare, Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Sounds good.
Now this is obviously kind of a sensitive, complex topic.
For sure.
We're going to try to approach it carefully.
Right.
We're really going to focus on the historical context.
Yes.
And the weight of these decisions that were made.
Absolutely.
So picture this. Summer 1945.
Okay.
World War II is raging, and President Truman is wrestling with a monumental decision. How to end the war with Japan.
You can see why this was such a heavy burden for Truman. The Pacific War was incredibly brutal.
Right.
Just look at the Battle of Okinawa, which happened just a few months earlier, from April to June 1945.
Over 12,500 American soldiers lost their lives.
Yeah.
And hundreds of thousands of Japanese died.
Yeah.
Many of them civilians.
Exactly. And that was just one battle.
Wow.
It became a terrifying preview of what a full-scale invasion of Japan might look like.
And the projections for that potential invasion, Operation Downfall, were truly grim.
Military planners estimated that a land invasion could cost up to 1 million American lives.
Wow.
That's a staggering number.
Yeah,
A truly unthinkable scenario.
it is.
You can understand the immense pressure Truman was under to find a way to end the war swiftly.
Okay, so Truman's got this horrific situation on his hands,
Yeah.
and then there's the Manhattan Project looming in the background.
Ah, the Manhattan Project. This was a top-secret U.S. government initiative that started back in 1941.
Right. The goal.
To develop the atomic bomb.
To develop the atomic bomb.
Yes.
By July 1945, they had achieved that goal,
Wow.
producing a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen.
And just a few weeks later, on July 25th, Truman made the decision to authorize the use of the atomic bomb. And intelligence reports at the time painted a very bleak picture. They suggested that Japan had over 2 million soldiers,
Wow.
prepared to defend their homeland, ready to fight to the death.
Yeah.
There were even reports that civilians were being trained for resistance,
Oh, wow.
including tactics like suicide bombings.
So you've got this incredibly powerful weapon,
Right.
a determined enemy, seemingly willing to fight to the bitter end,
Yeah,
and a president facing the potential for catastrophic losses.
absolutely.
It's a recipe for a truly world-altering decision.
And that decision was made manifest on August 6, 1945,
Right.
at 8:45 in the morning.
Okay.
The B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped Little Boy, the first atomic bomb, on Hiroshima.
Can you describe the immediate aftermath of the bombing?
The devastation was almost unimaginable. Around 80,000 people were killed instantly.
Right.
And tens of thousands more would succumb to radiation poisoning in the weeks, months, and years that followed.
And just 3 days later, on August 9th, the second atomic bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki.
Right.
What can you tell us about that event?
Well, the original target for that second bomb was actually Kokura. But there was heavy cloud cover over the city,
Okay.
forcing the bomber crew to divert to their secondary target, Nagasaki.
And even though the terrain around Nagasaki somewhat mitigated the immediate impact,
Yeah.
the death toll was still horrific.
Over 40,000 people perished in that second bombing.
Oh my gosh.
It was a devastating blow,
Yeah.
and it fundamentally changed the course of the war.
We've talked about the numbers,
Right?
casualties, the sheer scale of the destruction.
Yeah.
But it's essential to remember that we're talking about real people.
Right?
Families, entire communities wiped out in an instant.
Absolutely.
To truly understand the human cost of these events, we need to go beyond the statistics
Yes.
and look at the individual stories of those who survived.
You're absolutely right. And there's no better place to do that than in the pages of John Hersey's powerful reporting for The New Yorker,
Yeah.
published in 1946.
Right.
Hersey went to Hiroshima
Okay.
and interviewed survivors,
Right.
people who experienced the unimaginable and lived to tell the tale.
Oh.
He spoke with Miss Toshiko Sasaki, a young clerk,
Okay.
Father Wilhelm Kleinsorge, a German Jesuit priest, Dr. Terufumi Sasaki, a surgeon at the Red Cross Hospital,
Right.
and Mrs. Hatsuyo Nakamura, a widowed seamstress, just to name a few.
Yeah.
Their accounts are haunting,
Yeah.
poignant and essential to understanding the true cost of these bombings.
So you have these two incredibly destructive events.
Right.
And then just 6 days after the bombing of Nagasaki, Emperor Hirohito makes a decision.
He decides to end the suffering and bear the unbearable.
Okay.
In other words, he decides to surrender.
Wow.
On August 15th, 1945, Japan formally surrendered,
Right.
bringing an end to World War II.
The war is over. But the debate over the use of the atomic bombs was just beginning.
It was.
What were the main justifications put forward by the U.S. government
Okay.
and military leaders for using these weapons?
Well, the primary justification, the one that was emphasized repeatedly, was the desire to avoid the catastrophic casualties that would have resulted from a land invasion of Japan.
You mentioned earlier that Operation Downfall, the planned invasion,
Right.
was projected to result in up to 1 million American deaths.
Yes.
That's a truly horrifying number.
It is. And Truman himself stated in his memoirs that he regarded the bomb as a military weapon and never had any doubt that it should be used.
Wow.
He firmly believed that using the atomic bombs would ultimately save lives,
Okay.
both American and Japanese,
Yeah.
by forcing a swift surrender and preventing a protracted
Right.
and incredibly bloody conflict.
I imagine the fierce resistance the U.S. military encountered during the Battle of Okinawa played a significant role in shaping that thinking.
Absolutely. Okinawa demonstrated the lengths to which the Japanese were willing to go to defend their homeland.
Right.
Military leaders were convinced that a mainland invasion would be met with fanatical resistance.
Yeah.
Not only from soldiers, but from civilians as well.
So we've got the argument that the bombs were used to save lives.
Yes.
But of course, that justification has been
Right.
and continues to be heavily debated.
That's right.
There are those who argue that alternative strategies could have achieved the same outcome without resorting to such devastating weapons.
Yeah.
Some historians suggest that the U.S. could have chosen a different way to demonstrate the bomb's power
Right.
without targeting cities full of civilians.
Like a demonstration on an uninhabited island?
Yeah, like a demonstration on an uninhabited island or a military installation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The thinking is that such a demonstration might have been enough to persuade Japan to surrender
Okay.
without causing such immense loss of life.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
But I imagine there were counter-arguments to that approach as well.
There were.
Yeah.
Military leaders at the time were skeptical that a demonstration would be enough to break Japan's will to fight.
Right.
They argued that Japan's military leadership, deeply entrenched in a culture of honor and sacrifice, might not have been swayed by a mere demonstration of power, no matter how impressive.
Yeah.
They needed to see the devastating effects firsthand.
And then there's the issue of the sheer scale of the Manhattan Project, which cost billions of dollars.
Right.
I imagine there was immense pressure to justify that investment
Yeah.
and demonstrate the bomb's effectiveness.
Absolutely. Historian Peter Kuznick has argued that the sheer scale of the Manhattan Project created its own momentum,
Okay.
pushing for the bomb's use in a way that went beyond purely military considerations.
So we have these competing narratives and interpretations of the events leading up to the bombings.
Right.
On the one hand, you've got the view often referred to as the Orthodox view, which argues that the bombings were a necessary evil to end the war quickly and save lives. But on the other hand...
You have historians who take a more revisionist stance.
Okay.
They argue that the bombings were more about containing the Soviet Union's influence in the post-war world
Okay.
than about defeating Japan.
Right.
They believe that Japan was already on the verge of surrender
Okay.
and that the bombings were therefore unnecessary
Yeah.
from a purely military standpoint.
It sounds like this is a debate that goes far beyond the battlefield. It touches on issues of politics, power, and the very nature of warfare itself.
It absolutely does. And it forces us to confront some very difficult questions
Yeah.
about the use of weapons of mass destruction and the long-term consequences of such actions.
So we've laid out the context.
Right.
We've explored the justifications and the counter-arguments.
Yeah.
But before we move on, I think it's important to take a step back
Okay.
and really reflect on the human cost of these events.
Oh,
We've talked about the tens of thousands killed instantly,
right.
but the long-term effects were just as devastating.
Think about it.
Yeah.
The survivors of those bombings had to live with the physical and psychological scars
Right.
of those events for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
And then there's the impact on future generations.
Right.
The genetic damage caused by radiation exposure.
Yeah.
The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't just isolated events.
Right.
They cast a long shadow over the future.
Those are truly sobering thoughts.
They are.
And before we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Okay.
I want to circle back to John Hersey's reporting.
Okay, yeah.
You mentioned earlier that he interviewed survivors.
Yeah.
What were some of the things they told him? What were their experiences like?
Hersey's work is filled with heartbreaking detail.
Yeah.
First-hand accounts that really bring home the human cost of these bombings. He describes the immediate aftermath of the Hiroshima bombing, the sheer scale of the destruction.
Oh.
He talks about how 100,000 people were killed instantly,
Ah.
vaporized in the blink of an eye.
Wow.
He paints a picture of a city transformed into a landscape of unimaginable horror,
Oh, wow.
a place where even the shadows of people were burned into the walls.
Those are incredibly powerful and disturbing images.
They are, but they're also essential to understanding the true cost of these bombings.
Right.
We can't allow ourselves to become numb to the statistics,
Right.
to forget that behind every number is a human life, a story of suffering and loss.
And it's important to remember that Hersey's reporting is just a small glimpse
It is.
into the vast human tragedy of these events.
Yes.
There are countless other stories out there, stories of pain, resilience, and the struggle to rebuild lives shattered by unimaginable violence.
Exactly. Hersey's work is a powerful reminder that we can't allow ourselves to forget the human cost of war, the individual lives that are forever altered by these events.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's heavy stuff.
It is.
It is.
But we've got to keep going.
We do. We do.
We'll pick it up in the next part.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's easy to get lost in the big picture, you know, the political and military calculations.
Yeah.
But those individual stories,
Right.
the human faces of this tragedy,
Yeah.
those are what truly stay with you.
They ground us
They do.
and remind us that these aren't just abstract historical events.
No.
They're stories about real people
They are.
who experienced unimaginable loss
Exactly.
and trauma.
And those stories, those experiences, highlight the enduring legacy of these bombings.
Right.
They ushered in the nuclear age, a time when the world had to confront
Yeah.
the very real possibility of total annihilation.
It's hard to overstate how much the world changed
It is.
on August 6th and 9th, 1945.
Absolutely.
It's like we stepped into a whole new era,
Yeah.
one defined by this terrifying power
Right.
we now possessed.
The atomic bombings forced the world to grapple with a new set of questions, new challenges, and new responsibilities.
We were forced to ask ourselves,
Right.
could we control this power?
Mm-hmm.
Could we prevent it from being used again?
And on a more immediate level, the bombings had a profound impact on the relationship
I imagine.
between the United States and Japan.
Think about it. You have two nations
Yeah.
locked in this incredibly brutal conflict.
It was.
And then in the span of a few days,
Right.
one uses a weapon of unimaginable power
Mm-hmm.
to completely subdue the other.
It's not hard to see how that would create a lot of complicated emotions, a lot of baggage to unpack.
Absolutely. And while the two nations
Right.
have since become close allies,
Yes.
the shadow of those events, those bombings, continues to linger.
It does.
It shapes both countries' understanding of their shared history,
Mm-hmm.
their relationship with each other, and their place in the world.
Absolutely.
So where does this leave us? We've explored the events
Okay.
leading up to the atomic bombings,
Right.
the justifications offered,
Mm-hmm.
the counter-arguments raised,
Yes.
the human toll,
Yeah.
and the lasting global impact.
Absolutely.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. And it's important to remember that even decades later,
Right.
the decision to use the atomic bombs
Yeah,
remains deeply controversial.
it is.
There are strong arguments on both sides of the debate,
Yeah.
and there's no easy answer.
Some, like Richard Overy,
Yes.
argue that the bombings were a necessary evil,
Right.
a horrific but ultimately unavoidable act that saved lives in the long run.
They point to the projected casualties of a land invasion, the fanatical resistance expected from the Japanese military,
Right.
and the desire to bring a swift end to a brutal war.
Yeah.
They argue that using the bombs, as terrible as it was the lesser of two evils.
But then you have historians like PMS Blackett,
Right,
who see things quite differently.
yeah.
They argue that the bombings were motivated more by Cold War politics than by military necessity.
They believe that Japan was already on the verge of surrender, that the Soviet invasion of Manchuria was a decisive turning point, and that the bombings were, in a sense, overkill, a display of American power intended to intimidate the Soviet Union.
So we've got these two very different interpretations of history.
You do.
Each with its own set of supporting evidence and arguments.
They do.
It's a reminder that history is rarely black and white.
It is, and it highlights the importance of critical thinking, of examining the evidence, of considering multiple perspectives.
It's about recognizing that history isn't just a set of facts to be memorized.
No.
It's an ongoing conversation.
It is.
A process of interpretation and reinterpretation.
And in the case of the atomic bombings, it's a conversation with profound ethical implications.
Yes.
These events force us to confront fundamental questions about the nature of war, the limits of violence, and the responsibilities of those who wield such immense power.
They challenge us to think deeply about the choices we make as individuals, as nations, as a global community.
And those challenges aren't confined to the past. They're just as relevant today as we navigate a world filled with new dangers, new technologies, and new possibilities for both good and evil.
I think that's one of the key takeaways from this deep dive. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki aren't just historical events.
They're not.
They're a warning, a reminder
of
the potential consequences of our actions.
They are.
A call to action for peace and understanding.
They're a plea for us to learn from the mistakes of the past, to seek peaceful resolutions to conflict, and to work together to create a world where such horrors are never repeated.
So we've covered a lot of ground today.
You have.
We've explored the events, the justifications, the counter-arguments, and the lasting legacy of the atomic bombings. It's been a heavy conversation, but an essential one.
Absolutely. And as we move towards concluding this deep dive, I think it's important to leave our listeners with some key questions to ponder. Some food for thought.
Okay, hit us with those questions.
Knowing what we know now about the horrors of nuclear war, about the human cost of conflict, could there have been a different path? A better way to end World War II? Could we have achieved peace without resorting to such devastating violence?
That's a good question.
And perhaps even more importantly, how do these events inform our understanding of conflict resolution today? What lessons can we draw from this history to help us build a more peaceful and just world?
Those are big questions, tough questions.
They are.
But they're questions worth asking.
They are.
They're questions that each of us needs to grapple with. They really are. And it's not about finding easy answers or simple solutions.
It's about engaging in a thoughtful and nuanced dialogue. About being willing to challenge our own assumptions. And about recognizing the complexities of these issues.
And one of the things that strikes me is how much these events, these bombings, continue to resonate today. They're not just relegated to history books.
They're not.
They're still very much a part of our collective consciousness.
That's because they represent a turning point in human history. They mark the moment when we as a species acquired the ability to destroy ourselves, to wipe out entire civilizations in the blink of an eye.
And that knowledge, that awareness of our own destructive potential has shaped everything that's come since. It's influenced the way we think about war. About peace.
Absolutely.
About the very future of humanity.
Think about it. The entire Cold War was shaped by the specter of nuclear annihilation. The threat of mutually assured destruction hung over the world like a dark cloud.
It did for decades.
And even today, in a world that's thankfully moved beyond the binary standoff of the Cold War, the threat of nuclear proliferation, of rogue states or terrorist groups acquiring these weapons remains a very real concern.
It's a reminder that the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki isn't just about the past. It's very much about the present and the future.
Okay, so we've explored the historical context. We've delved into the justifications and the debates. We've reflected on the human cost and the lasting global impact. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back
Right.
to those thought-provoking questions you posed earlier.
Okay.
Knowing what we know now, could there have been a different path, a better way to end World War II?
That's the question that historians and ethicists have been wrestling with for decades.
Right.
And it's a question that doesn't have a simple answer.
Some argue that a demonstration of the bomb's power, perhaps on an uninhabited island, could have been enough to force Japan's surrender.
But as we discussed earlier, there's no guarantee that such a demonstration would have had the same psychological impact as the actual bombings.
And even if it had, would it have fundamentally altered the course of history? Would we still be living in a world shaped by the threat of nuclear war? These are hypothetical questions, of course, but they're worth considering.
They are. They force us to think critically about the choices that were made, about the paths not taken, and about the possibility of different outcomes.
They remind us that history isn't predetermined, that it's a tapestry woven from countless individual decisions, actions, and reactions.
And that even in the darkest of times, there's always the possibility for hope, for change, for a better future.
I like that. A possibility for hope. Because ultimately that's what this all comes down to. It's about learning from the mistakes of the past, about recognizing the interconnectedness of our world, and about working together to build a future where peace and understanding prevail.
It's been a heavy but incredibly important conversation.
It has.
Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure, and thank you to all of our listeners for taking this journey with us.
We encourage you to continue exploring these topics. To keep asking those tough questions. And to never lose sight of the human stories. At the heart of these historical events.
Because it's through understanding the past that we can hope to shape a better future.
That's a great note to end on.
It is.
Thanks again for listening, everyone. Until next time, keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.